provisions. We think that that should happen through the regular course of proposing a statute that would amend those provisions. And the Parents' Rights Initiative did not do that. So this bill would eliminate some of the inconsistent language that has now caused confusion among school districts about what the law is on notification and whether those students still have the right to make those decisions on their own.
I'll just add, excuse me, I'm well, but I've lost my voice. I will just add that the ambiguity in the initiative is something that we discussed and asked about when we heard the bills or the initiative last year, anticipated this, and knew we may have to come back and clarify the law for schools to be able to operate. So this is not really a surprise if you listen to our floor discussion and if you listen to the questions we asked in committee. It was to clarify that this did not impact what Senator Peterson just mentioned. That needs to be clarified for schools to operate.
Just to hop in with a follow-up there on 1296, there's been a lot of controversy around the immediately versus as soon as possible, but within 48 hours for reporting to parents if a school employee was involved in a sexual assault against their child. Can you explain a little bit about why that 48 hours can be necessary sometimes, and also what the current process is for if immediately is encapsulated in that as soon as possible, except for in some sort of like circumstances?
So thank you for that question. Happy to clarify. That 48-hour provision has been on the books for 20 years. It allows for schools to do exactly what the Republicans are saying Democrats are trying to stop, which is to immediately notify parents. So that claim is untrue and irresponsible, in my opinion, to cause confusion for the public. In addition to that, the 48 hours, I believe, in the time that it was first put in statute, gave time for school officials and law enforcement, if necessary, to get the facts clear so that accurate information is provided to the right adults who are responsible for that child. And, we are happy to take a look at that provision in this bill. But the question that's being called around whether or not Democrats care to make sure parents are immediately notified is unbecoming of an elected official, I believe, to be causing that kind of confusion for the public. And as a person who's been directly asked why I intend to keep information from parents, as a teacher and as a parent, I find that claim unprofessional and confusing for the public in a way that is irresponsible.
Why not go with 24 hours instead of 48?
Would that change the question we receive about whether or not 24 is also immediate? I mean, we will take a look at that and make sure that we are very clear about our commitment to make sure kids are safe and that their first teachers, their parents, get the notification they need. That was not the amendment that was offered.
Yeah, and I'll just say that the timeline in the existing statute comes from a bipartisan bill that came from over here. It was Senator Colwell's and Senator Benton, both of whom I served with, who came up with that language, and it passed unanimously out of both chambers of the legislature. So, if we need to revisit that, I think we can always talk about that. But fundamentally, schools are going to notify as soon as they practicably can, right? And that's not changing with the bill one way or the other.
Why do you feel like that's coming into question right now? Like, why now? Why is this issue coming up that's been on the books for 20-some years?
That's an excellent question for the Republicans, I would say. But, I think this is just politics at its worst. We've seen this game before when the legislature was discussing and passing mandatory sexual health education. Lies were told about what teachers were doing in classrooms, and that's no different from what's happening now. I find it offensive.
I want to ask about today's Alzheimer's Advocacy Day. A lot of patients' families here, they're worried about Senate Bill 5337, which would require training, certification, The Governor Inslee's budget eliminates the one Department of Health position that researches this. I don't know if any of you are meeting with those folks today, but what, in a tight budget year, do you see that as one of those topics that gets priority treatment this session?
You know, it's always important to us to hear from our constituents and hear what things they care about. I think one of the interesting things that happened is that as Governor Inslee left and put out his budget plans, the only one that got any attention really was his so-called Book 2 budget that added a bunch of revenue and avoided the cuts that would be required if we were not to have any new revenue. I think what you mentioned about the Alzheimer's-related funding would be only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we would be facing if we had an unbalanced solution to the budget crisis. And as we go through the next few weeks of hearings in Senate Ways and Means and House Appropriations about what even a balanced approach will look like in terms of the reductions that we'll need to make, I think you're going to have a lot more people coming forward expressing alarm. You know, and it's a funny thing. There's this Seattle Chamber poll that finds that people want lower taxes. Well, that's a big surprise. The reality is when you ask them to balance that, put that in context of, well, do you want lower taxes if that means that we have to lower teacher pay, or if we have to have higher class sizes and or not provide services to kids with disabilities? Guess what? The answer is most people are more nuanced than just we don't want higher taxes. We had 3 big polls about 3 specific questions this last November, right? Do you want to reduce environmental protections and funding for carbon reduction? Turns out close to 2/3 of the people said no. Do you want to reduce education funding and funding for childcare, and so that we don't have to have a capital gains tax anymore? Turns out even more people said no to that. And even on the one that's paid by everybody in their payroll, do you want to reduce funding, you want to get rid of a payroll tax so that we won't have a long-term care benefit? The people said no. So on the poll that really matters, I think the guidance that we're getting from our voters is that they are willing to pay for services when the connection is made and when we make the case that we need those tax revenues.
Just a quick little finer point on your question, Drew. So if you look at Inslee Book 1, which is his budget with no revenue, $500 million cut to long-term care and DD services in that Book 1. So it's important that we start getting clear on what the real results of an unbalanced approach to getting toward a final budget are. And a cuts-only budget is like the Book 1 budget that he put out. If we don't do any revenue at all, what Governor Inslee put out is likely to be the path that would have to be taken. And it's not just $500 million reduction in long-term care and DD services. It's $250 million cut to higher ed. It is eliminating Medicaid adult dental, eliminating Medicaid kidney dialysis, eliminating Medicaid abortion services and family planning services. All those things are going to end up probably having to fall if we're not able to take a balanced approach, which means reductions, yes, but also revenue. And I think that the poll that we saw in November tells us that voters, as Senator Peterson said, are more balanced in their thinking also.
And I'll just add, you're not talking about substance use disorder treatment, mental health treatment, access for special needs kids. That's all on the chopping block.
Can I follow up, Senator Peterson? You brought it up, the chamber poll. I'm not sure if you've looked at all the PowerPoints or seen the data, but having looked at the polls, there's large percentages that aren't buying that message. They ask questions about all these topics, and they get the impression the legislature is spending too much. Even if you tax big businesses and wealthy, there's more than 50% are concerned it would still reach them at the ground, at the level of their home, and they believe you don't raise money, you have enough money for your priorities. So how do you bridge that gap between what you sense from November and what this poll shows from January, that that there's a great perception legislature spends too much?
Well, so look, we've just had a sustained period of both earned and paid media by Enterprise Washington talking about how awful the legislature is and how recklessly we've been spending for the last, how many, fill in the blank, number of years, without any balanced messaging about what that actually has meant in terms of investments in public schools, in childcare, in housing, environmental protection, in healthcare. And we're about to begin the part of the legislative process where we talk about what's at stake and let the public come and talk to us about the value of these services to them, right? That's the nature of our process. And, then we'll go back in a year and a half and stand for election. But I'll just say, during the period when these exact questions about balance were on the ballot, which party picked up seats in the legislature? I mean, for the first time since 1944, we had a clean sweep of every statewide elected office by Democrats, and Speaker Jenkins and I both gained a seat in our chambers. So, with due respect, I'm not going to take a single poll with, I don't know how many, 400 people answering questions to outweigh the answer that millions of voters gave us in November.
Do you think, though, there would have been a different result in November had the Office of Financial Management and Governor Inslee released the letter not on November 8th, but say September 8th, predicting a $12 billion shortfall? I mean, that information was available June, July, September. It was very clear. You were using numbers like $8 to $10 billion shortfall in meetings throughout early and later. But if there had been widespread coverage of the shortfall, do you think the public would have responded the same way in November?
Yes.
I'll switch subjects on you. This is for Representative Jenkins and Senator Peterson. You sent out a news release yesterday that was sort of a rallying cry to defend transgender people. What prompted this, and what I'm driving at is, do you feel threats are coming from within the state of Washington, or are you feeling that the threats are coming from the feds? And second, other than waving the flag, do you have any specific legislative measures that you want to introduce on this topic?
As Speaker, I look both nationally and locally what's going on. So you can look through the bills that were filed this session in the House, and there are certainly bills that are attacking trans people and trans youth in particular that have been filed in the House.
I'll be disrespectful of the Republicans. They're the minority party, and they file lots of bills that never go anywhere.
That's very true, and we know that, John, but you know what? The trans people and the parents of trans youth out there do not know that. The mere filing, the number of calls that I get just by the mere filing of a bill like that, like Rep. Jacobson has filed a couple of those, the number of calls that I get is extraordinary, and people are petrified for their kids and for themselves. So it is not, I can certainly sit here and say those bills are not going to get a hearing, they're not going to move forward, and that's what I tell these parents, but it doesn't stop the concern that they feel for their children. And then when we see what's happening at the national level and the executive orders, and the very first executive orders issued definitely were attacks on trans youth to a large extent. So it is important for people in this state to understand that Washington will remain, and that the House and Senate Democrats will remain a place that will look to protect trans people, transgender people, and transgender youth and youth who have questions about their gender identity, so that they have the safety to process through all of those things. And that we will work very hard to maintain the protections we have. I mean, Washington State has some of the strongest protections in the nation, and we will look to keep those protections.
The parents and the kids who call and text don't know that those bills are not going anywhere. That is harmful to them, and that is true in a number of areas.
Yeah, and I'll just say, you know, you'd think a House bill, like you wouldn't, if you know the process well, you wouldn't start worrying about a House bill too much until it had made it a long ways toward the Senate. My office has received over 500 contacts from my constituents living in my district about House Bill 1038. Now, the fact that I even know about a bill that is never going to get heard in the House is a sign of how alarmed people are. And this atmosphere of persecution and fear that's coming from the Trump administration means that I've got kids who are, and parents who are worried, sick, whose mental health is suffering because of their perception of being under attack. So when Speaker Jenkins suggested that we send out such a message, I was absolutely delighted to join her in that, because I feel like we have an obligation to the people of our state to let them know that we have their backs, that we are going to do everything that we can within our power to make sure that Washington remains a safe and welcoming place for them.
Do you have any legislation or even a resolution to address this that would be going through the legislature?
Well, I do think that the bills that we started off this press availability talking about in the House and the Senate relating to last year's parental rights initiative, that part of the work that's going on with those bills is to clarify the law, so especially young people and families and schools can have clarity in terms of what they can do, what is limited, and we've kind of already talked about that. So I think those are kind of some of the biggest pieces of legislation that we have going forward this year. And then it's really protecting the laws that we have passed historically to make sure that nothing gets rolled back, and certainly we won't allow that to happen this year either.
And that was a lot of the work that we did in 2018, 2019, in making sure we are protecting all Washingtonians. And if you take a look at the bills that we did in terms of access to health care, access to gender-affirming care, addressing hate crimes, that was all because of the concerns with the Trump administration. And so you don't see a lot of those bills because we have been protecting Washingtonians from his first administration. And so now it is about making sure that if there are any loopholes in those laws, we're closing them, really making sure we're reminding people that in this Washington, we will be protecting every vulnerable Washingtonian. That means our communities of color, our immigrants, our refugees, and our trans folk.
Final question on this topic. Trump administration declared there are two sexes, which I assume meaning non-binaries and transgenders are affected by that. And also, I can't remember, but there was the trans women in girls and women's sports issue. Does that affect trans kids in Washington State to the point that you can no longer have a trans girl in girls' sports. And is there anything realistic that Washington can do to contest that?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that Washington can do, Washington has already done, which is to prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity. We prohibit discrimination. Now, and so that is the fundamental underpinning of the way that Washingtonians and any sport network or any organization, that's the first thing they have to look at in terms of how they treat people in this state. Now, there's always going to be questions and issues about the underpinnings of how federal law and federal executive orders play themselves out related to Washington state law. And I think that's still something that we continue to work on, and we'll work with the Attorney General's office to make sure.
My bottom line is there going to be a legislative or legal challenge in the works in Washington state to those two specific executive orders?
You should probably talk to the Attorney General's office about that. They're the ones who pursue litigation related to executive orders. So I would talk, I guess my specific answer is talk to the Attorney General's office.
Thank you.
Senator Wellman indicated this morning that it could be a challenge to fully fund special education, basic materials, transportation, and the preschool lunch program, all as a specific about over the budget year. Have you begun discussions in your caucuses about which bills prioritize or how to kind of fund each one of those programs?
I'd say we're only at the very beginning of that process. I've said to you before that for our caucus, funding public schools is the highest priority in the budget. And we know, because we've heard from districts, that the biggest problems that they have right now come from our failure to provide for full funding of special education at the state level, and for failing to come up with material, supplies, and operating costs, as insurance and other costs have risen for school districts, and for failing to provide for transportation. When I have talked to advocates for education funding about which of those things they would like us not to do so that we could pay for school lunches for everyone, including families that can afford to pay for lunches, I have yet to find anybody who believes that funding lunches is a more important priority than funding special education or material, supplies, and operating costs. So I think that'll give you a sense of where I think we're probably headed.
We're in the same place. In appropriations, we're discussing the challenge, and not different. It's gone. I got through 1296. That's what I came to make sure I got through.
You should ask her who she yelled at so much to use her voice.
I have a list.
Senator Peterson, circle back to the beginning, because you guys are dealing with 5181 tomorrow. Is that the vehicle for the legislature to deal with the initiative? Is the goal to get that to the governor's desk soon because of the nature, or is the House bill going to take precedent? What's the process for you guys?
So Senator Wilson's bill 5181 is considerably narrower. It really changes only that one section of code that has to do with the initiative, and we're going to send that over to the House promptly. I think it's probably, we are absolutely, I think, open if Representative Stonier's bill comes over. We're absolutely open to looking at that and working with the House to make sure that we can get a broad set of protections done, as broad as both chambers can agree on and send to the governor. We have let the governor know that we anticipate sending amendments to the initiative to him soon in session.
Jerry, I would just say I think it's unlikely that we'll start hearing Senate bills before cutoff. Could happen, but we have a very high volume of House bills that we need to work our way through. But we will try, and we certainly Senator Wilson's bill will be heard by the Education Committee, and we're committed I guess I would just say ditto to what Senator Peterson just said.